Hi everyone, and welcome to my online seminar on scientific writing. So today we're going to look at some of the hard and fast rules of how to actually construct a thesis or a long essay or dissertation, and what tricks there are to make sure that you make it easy for the reader to understand your meaning and how to convey what you actually want to convey. The first port of call really is to understand what you are writing. So what do you want to write, and how do you go about constructing a thesis versus an essay? There are certain things that have to be adhered to no matter what you're writing. So we have certain literary conventions that must be adhered to, whether you're writing a 6-page essay or a 60-page thesis. So an essay is essentially a collection of facts which has been summarized to deliver on a particular topic or brief. This may or may not include original work done by the student. So most of the essays that we send you are essentially a collection of points of information which you have collated from other sources, which means they are all adequately and heavily referenced, and generally you actually haven't done any result work yourself. So you might have made comparisons yourself, but you haven't actually produced any tangible data yourself. A dissertation is what you will write in honors, and a dissertation is a research project or a long essay, so depending on how you want to classify it, and this is typically completed as part of an undergraduate or a postgraduate degree. So overseas, they do these sorts of theses or dissertations in 3rd year or 4th year degrees. You guys do it in honors. So even though that's classified as a postgraduate degree, your dissertation for your honors project is not a thesis, because it's not the entirety of your degree. It's a portion of it. It's only 32 credits, so it's not as if it's taking all of your time. Whereas a thesis is a long piece of writing where there is a theory that is either proved or disproved based on the work that is done by the student. Now that could be the case for a dissertation. However, remember, a dissertation is a small component of your degree in total, whereas a thesis represents everything that you've done for that degree. So you will be technically writing dissertations. However, when we talk about this, often people just use the word thesis. Don't get too stuck on that. Just remember that there is actually a difference between them. I'm first going to talk to you about some of the formatting styles that are really important when you're writing any piece of work, anything that you're doing. And one of the most important things is, first of all, to stick to the brief. The brief is whatever instructions you have been given by either your course lecturer or your honors project supervisor. So follow what they want you to do, because typically there will be some sort of stringent format style that they want you to follow. If there's no brief given, then stick with the basics. Use 11 or 12 point font, a simple font like Calibri or Times New Roman. Use standard margins. Don't try and make your margins smaller so that you can have more text on a page. Just use the space that you're given wisely. If it's too long and you've got a very strict word count or length count, then take some of your content out. If it's not necessary, then take it out. And then 1.15 to 1.5 line spacing. Don't go for any more than that. The whole goal of making sure that we set a writing style is so that your work is easy to read. If you have too little space in a sentence, then it can be very difficult to read those words, and it makes the reader irritated, subconsciously actually, by the structure of your work. If there's too much space, that's the same thing. You're reading lines and there's about 10 lines on a page and it's just tedious. So if you look here on the right hand side, I've given you some examples. This is exactly the same content, and you can see here at the top I've got 1.5 times line spacing in Calibri, and it's 11 point font, and it's nice and easy to read. It's not justified. I don't mind if things aren't justified, because I would rather have equal spacing between words than have something spread across a line. So you'll see here at every point in this paragraph you have the same spacing between words. That makes it a lot easier to read. So if you justify this, obviously it's going to drag that sentence across, which means there's gaps between the words is going to get bigger. that for me is not very conducive to easy reading. That's my opinion. You can justify things if you want to. But if you look down here, I've got a different font, which is much narrower. It's bolder, so it's actually darker. The writing is really close together, and I've made this 14 size. So if you were to use 11 point font for this, it would be tiny. It's really close together, and it's not easy to read. I mean, it looks nice if you were going to present it for something, but actually, if you were actually going to read it, it doesn't read as nicely as the one above that. So stick to the basics. I know it seems boring, but the whole reason why you're doing this is to make the reader, it's easier for the reader. Following on from the writing style is now the formatting style. So when we format anything, we use headings. Headings are to collect thoughts and ideas into one particular place. If an essay has no headings, it means it has no structure. So numerous times last year I was reading essays, and it was very frustrating because I was trying to understand what the point of a paragraph was, but I didn't even know what category that idea was in. Headings are typically given to you, or you can just follow the conventional headings that are typical of an essay or a thesis, such as introduction, geological setting, aims and objectives, methodology, results, discussion, conclusions. There's nothing complicated about that. If you don't know what a heading should be, think about it in that standpoint. Also look at other theses or dissertations or scientific papers. We should be basing all of our work on the structure in academic literature, because that's what you essentially should be aiming towards. When you do different headings, use a different formatting style for those headings. So this can be for headings and subheadings, and keep it consistent. So I like to use the same format that is used in scientific papers, because that convention is typically consistent over a number of journals, and it also makes it nice and easy to understand. So you can see there on the right hand side, when we have a big heading, so there you can see 4 point nothing, that's methods. So chapter 4 is essentially methods. 4.1 is a subsection of methods, and that is italicized. If you then have a 4.1.1, that would be in plain font. And it's best to try and not go too far with the different subheadings. So if you see here on the right hand side, you can have an introduction and then previous studies. And within those previous studies, you might need to go into a lot of detail about particular iron ore deposits. And then you can break down where those occur, so 2 different mines, and then manganese ore deposits. But you can see here, you're getting into really sort of complex subheading numbering. I would never go further than 4. If you need to have a breakdown there, you lose those numbers. So if you have another subheading under one of these headings, you would just have a heading without a number. Okay, so try not to use more than 4. Even 4 is quite extreme. So if you wanted to, you could have 3 there, and then just have the headings below that of the names without any more bulleted numbers. As much as you're constructing a dissertation, and this can also be said for an essay, depending on how complex it is, most certainly a thesis, when you're writing a dissertation, you need to aim for a very particular scientific method. So for all of your projects, you should have discussed with your supervisor what the whole point of the project is. And that is where we ask a question. So what do we want to answer? What question do we want to ask that we're trying to find an answer for? And that is the first step in our scientific method. In order to ask that question and to then answer it, we have to do background research. So you might have to do background research before you can even ask that question. Once we know where the background is going, we construct a hypothesis, or we ask a research question, and then we want to test that hypothesis. So this is where we start to collect results. So in this scientific method breakdown, it says you're going to test with an experiment. That experiment could be going into the field, collecting samples, doing geochemical analyses, doing rock mechanics testing, doing soils testing, all of that sort of stuff. And we're going to use those data that we collect from that experiment to test whether the process is working. If it's working, which it normally does because it has been thought out by your lecturer, so they would hope or your supervisor, they would hope that it's working. So then yes, we can actually use our data to test the hypothesis. Then we analyze those data and draw conclusions, and then we communicate the results in our dissertation. If we don't actually get anything working, that's when we have to troubleshoot the procedure, and perhaps you actually need to do further experiments, or you need to change your experiments. Sometimes also the data don't align perfectly with the hypothesis. So we have to then take the sort of the loss of importance and go back to the beginning and construct a hypothesis. You will never need to do that for an honors project, because your honors projects are succinct, small studies. But if you were writing a PhD and your data did not align with your hypothesis at all, which means that you did totally the wrong thing, you would have to change your hypothesis. So sometimes, it's not ideal, but sometimes that happens when we don't actually have a very well constructed hypothesis. And therefore you go and collect results without any aims and objectives, and then you have to actually make aims and objectives based on the data that you've collected. That's not a great situation to be in. So hopefully none of you are in that situation. So that's what we aim for in terms of the breakdown of our scientific method. So when you're doing your thesis, try and think about the stage of the process that you're in. If it's coming towards the end of the year and you're only testing your hypothesis then, you need to be very cautious and you need to be very aggressive from then on, because you still have to analyze the data, draw conclusions, align those with your hypothesis, and then communicate those results. So all of these processes should be done before mid-year. Invariably, things don't go properly and you get distracted and the year isn't quite what you thought it was, and that's why I put this little cartoon diagram here on the right hand side, because that is what invariably happens when you're trying to test any hypothesis. You end up making yourself a cup of tea, getting distracted for 3 weeks, not doing any work, and then when you eventually find some results, it doesn't match with what you thought you were going to find, so you sulk or you throw a tantrum and you've got to start all over again. So be aware of the pitfalls of doing research, and that is what this diagram actually shows you. So don't think that everything is going to go perfectly to plan, and prepare for that and make sure that you're ready to take the next step or go back and start again if you need to. And don't worry, you'll eventually get there. You're not going to be publishing your results, or hopefully some of you will be, but that will be your hypothesis supported and writing of your dissertation at the end. And then I give you full permission to do a little dance. The first thing that you normally think about when you read any kind of scientific writing is the abstract. If you read an academic paper, or if you're reading a dissertation from a previous honors student, all of these studies will start with an abstract. So when do you need an abstract? Well, mostly essays do not need an abstract, and that's because the essay is not normally long enough to warrant having a summary of that essay. However, if your lecturer or your supervisor asks you to write a summary for an essay, then please write an abstract, and don't say, Dr. Hoyer said I don't need to write an abstract for an essay. Write the abstract. Okay, so always ask whoever is giving you this assignment whether you actually need an abstract for it. I will only ask you to write an abstract if I ask you specifically for a particular type of abstract. So there's a layman's summary or a layman's abstract, which is where you get the layman, which is anyone on the street. If you wanted to try and convey an idea of your essay in normal words without too much geological jargon, then that would be a layman's summary. So that would be, your mom and dad would be able to read it and understand what you're talking about. Then there's an executive summary, which is typically something that is done from a business point of view. So if you have a professional document, so a technical report or something like that, then often you have an executive summary. Again, that would be for a really long document that would be summarizing the most crucial points. When we're talking about a thesis or a dissertation, these documents are always preceded by an abstract. An abstract is a concise summary of the work that you have undertaken and what it means. So it is not a section of conclusions, it is not an introduction, it is between 200 and 400 words, and it must include those criteria there. So what work has been done? Why did that work get done? What was necessary to do that work? What were the results? Briefly, I don't need you to give me every single data point that you collected, but what are the results in general? And then what are the implications of that result? Like, what does that actually mean, especially in comparison with your hypothesis? And then what conclusions were drawn? And so that is, writing an abstract actually relatively tricky because you have to have all of that information ready there. So an abstract should really be written towards the end of your study so that you know what conclusions you have drawn and what your results are. You can't be expected to write an abstract for a dissertation that is incomplete. So now we're getting to the meat of the dissertation. What do we actually need to include in the main portion of a dissertation? So we're not worrying about the abstract now. We need to actually start with our dissertation or thesis. And you start not writing, but you start a dissertation with an introduction. So an introduction allows the reader to understand the content in the rest of the text. So it means that where we're standing, looking towards what the study is going to be, everyone should be able to read that introduction and know what is coming for the rest of the dissertation. So this must include essentially the what, why, where, and how. So what are you studying? Why are you doing that? Where is it being done? And how is it being undertaken? Now, this broad introduction category covers all of those topics, as well as an introductory statement to the beginning of your dissertation. So the first thing you need to write about is the hook and the topic. So what is the study about? You obviously want to make sure that the reader can understand what the study is actually going to be about. What is the topic? And then your position. So where are you doing, where are you doing it? Why are you doing the study? And then present your research questions. And then what points do you hope to achieve? Well, that would be your essentially gearing up for your discussion. So we have, we're going to get these results somehow, and this is what we hope to achieve by actually doing this study. So what we always have to think about is, what is the purpose of the research that you're doing? Why is it important? What is that topic? And how are we going to make sure that the research makes sense? And the first thing that you will write about in your introduction is the what, which is your topic of discussion. So you need to elaborate on what your topic is. So for example, if you're looking at, I don't know, like this, look at your essay topic, asteroid mining versus mining mid-ocean ridges. You need to elaborate on that. So what are you actually talking about? What would entail in those processes? And how would we actually make sure that everyone understands the content that will be discussed later? You can include previous studies in this section. So that would be a literature review. That can be part of the same section, or it can be after this portion. It depends on where it fits with the writing. I can't tell you where your literature review should go. In most academic papers, it is included in the first portion of the introduction, so that you can build up to the aims and objectives. Because often what happens is there's a gap in the literature, and that is being filled by your study. So if you review all of the literature and then state your aims and objectives, it's very clear where your data or your research will fill that gap. Now, your studies may not fill that gap. You aren't always doing brand new research, so don't worry about that. That's not the point of an honors project. Your honors project is to take a hypothesis and test it and write about it. So it doesn't always have to be that you're filling this gap in the literature. That would be a PhD level. So we always have to discuss similar studies that have been done in similar areas, or in similar rock types, or in similar construction situations, and we need to tailor make the what as a research question. So what are you doing is the research question, essentially. The why of why you're doing that is critical. Without a why, you do not have a study, because if you're just testing something and you don't actually produce a why, then it's just a technical report. So it's really important that when we're relating to a thesis or a dissertation, that we have a critical why. And the why is essentially the purpose of the work. So what is our purpose for doing this analysis or these analyses? And the why typically comes in the form of an aims and objectives section. Now the aims and objectives, like I said, are usually after the introductory section where we have discussed what the topic is and we've looked at the previous studies or a literature review. And after that we can state the aims and objectives. The aim is different to the objectives. So an aim of the research is what is the research question being addressed and the purpose of the research. So that's the big question. And then on top of that, so we're going to build on that aim, are the objectives. And the objectives are the proposed steps that need to be taken to be able to complete the aim. So you could aim to, I'm just trying to think of something off the top of my head. So you could aim to understand the complexity of the faulting in KwaZulu-Natal in order to understand the processes that occurred during Gondwana breakup. So the objectives to match that aim would be that you would need to do field mapping. You would need to go and do field mapping to undertake structural measurements, map in the fault orientations, and then you would need to determine paleostress diagrams or environments based on the results that you got, and then compare those to stages of Gondwana breakup that you know about from the literature. And then the last thing would be is to create a model for how the coastline deformed and how it was created based on your analyses. So can you see how we have the primary aim, and then below that we have the steps that we need to take to make sure that that aim is addressed. And the aims and objectives can change, and it really sucks when they do, but sometimes they change if the data that you get doesn't work, if you need to redo something, and often, especially when we get to later studies like MSc and PhD, it's very difficult to make sure that what you test and the results that you get meet the aims that you originally set out to do. So the aims and objectives are important to have as an idea, but I would recommend rewriting these at the end of your thesis. So once you're done with your dissertation, re-look at your aims and objectives and make sure that what you actually did for your study is outlined in the aims and objectives section, because all of the points in your discussion should go back to what am I trying to do? What was the purpose of the research? So once you've written it, don't forget about it. Keep going back, keep tailor-making them, keep editing them. Make sure that they match with what you are doing. Okay, so the next step in the writing train is the geological setting. So you've got your introduction, you've got your section of previous studies or your literature review, and you've got your aims and objectives. Now you need to look at where your study is being based. And the where in the geology dissertation would be your geological setting. So this section obviously would not necessarily be critical in an essay, but it is certainly critical in a dissertation. And how you start to write your geological setting is based first on the regional geology and then the local geology. So the regional geology would be all of the rock types that you would have in the area and discussing their geological chronological framework. So for example, again, if we're doing a structural geology project along the coast of KZN, you would need to describe the types of rocks that you would be expecting to see there. So if you're doing that north of Durban, then you would look at the Karoo supergroup rocks. What are their geological settings? What are the rock types? How did they form? And then perhaps you're looking at a very small area, so then you would need to go into the local geology, and then you can talk about the types of rock types you would expect to see. So if you've got a Freihead formation, what would those rocks look like in particular? So you would get different types of sandstones, you get siltstones, coal horizons, shales, and then perhaps you've also got dolerites there from the Karoo Igneous Province dolerite suite. So those are all the things that you would need to talk about. In a geological setting, you always talk about everything chronologically. So you need to make sure that you talk about the oldest events or rock types first towards the youngest events. If you're talking about a project where there is a lot of deformation, you also need to talk about that. You cannot have a structural project without a deformation section. So then you would need to talk about deformation and or metamorphism that you know about, that's been written about in these areas. When you do your geological setting, it's really important to include visual information to help the reader understand the geology. So you need geological maps. or stratigraphic columns, or both, so that we can understand what the geology of the area looks like. And if you're doing a dissertation, especially for a thesis, so if you're doing a master's or PhD, you need to draw those maps yourself. So don't just copy and paste it out of someone else's thesis or out of someone else's document. It's best if you draw those from scratch. And please make sure that there's tangible understanding on those maps. There are so many awful geology maps that are presented in honors presentations. So if you don't know how to produce a map for your honors thesis, go and look at similar topics in the literature. Go and look at papers that have been written and how do I actually represent where the geology is. Okay, that's the best way to make sure that what you're doing is appropriate for your study. If there is that last point there, that note, if there is a time constraint for the project, which there normally isn't in geology, then you can have a subject on the when. So for example, in crop science, you would need to know growing seasons and all of that sort of stuff. So you would need to know timelines of when you did certain things. The when is not critical for our project, so we typically don't include that. So please don't put a thing saying on the 3rd of December, I went to this place to collect these samples, and on the 4th of January, we did this and that. That's not really important. Okay, it's not the way we write a dissertation. I've included some examples here of different locality maps or geological maps, which are not exactly what you would imagine they would be. And these can vary depending on the sub-discipline of geology that you're doing. So for example, on the left-hand side here, this is a locality map from Dr. Hastie's first paper that he published from his PhD. And you can see here you've got a regional map, there's Southern Africa, and then we're zooming into the actual study area, and then there's a cross-section there. So those would be the primary results of the study, summarized there to show the location. I've also shown you a very different geological map that I did for my honors project here, which is published in the space science journal Icarus, and that's showing the surface of Jupiter's moon of Europa, and I studied a lineament on the surface known as agonal linea. So that's a locality map. Okay, so they don't all have to be the same. And then this one here is from a paper from Prof. Green and others, showing an area on the KZN shelf where they are looking at seismic lines and bathymetry data. So you can see here there's South Africa, there's the regional environment, and then zooming in on those different areas to show where the results are actually occurring. So be creative. You don't have to just stick with whatever ArcGIS spits out for you. The last section in sort of your introductory chapter or chapters is the methodology. And the methodology is always talked about before your results section. And the methodology details the how. So how was your study done? What processes were used to obtain your results? And here, depending on how technical your project is, you might have a very long methodology section, or you might have a very short methodology section. So if you were doing, like I said, the faulting project along the coast of KZN, you would need to describe how you did field mapping and what kind of field mapping you did, and you used a compass with right-hand rule taking dip and strike or dip and azimuth, and then that would be the sum total of your methodology because you don't have a lot of technical processes. However, if you've used equipment and you've made analyses about anything, then you have to describe how all of that equipment works. You have to name the equipment, say what it does, and also sometimes you need to say what kind of results you expect from these analyses. Not in detail, but if you're doing UCS testing, what parameter is that going to give you? What sort of rock strength test is that, and what does it mean? A methodology section is extremely important for a dissertation, so your honors projects or a thesis, MSc, PhD, but when you are doing an essay, you don't need a methodology unless you're producing your own results. So every time you are doing results, you're including results that you have created on your own in this study, you need a methodology section. Sometimes methodology can be a subsection of the introduction, or it can be a whole section on its own, and this is dependent on the length of the section. However, if you're breaking the study down like I have, I would recommend having a methodology section on its own, as its own chapter. And you do that right before the results section, so that everyone's just read through the processes that you did, and now they're going to read through the results that you obtained from using those processes. So really nice and smooth. The results section is a really critical part of your thesis. It is where you show all of the observations that you have made through the course of your work. So it's your own work in either a raw state or a process state, but you have to here show the reader what you have done to try and analyze a hypothesis. Now remember that you're not going to discuss these results at all. They are simply in the form of observations. And observations are very different to interpretations. So your observations go in your results, and your interpretations go into the discussion. And this is probably the most crucial thing you can ever sort of try and get right about academic writing. If you don't separate your results from your discussion, then it is an absolute mess when trying to get someone to understand what you actually did and what was done by others. So an easy way of understanding if you've written your results section correctly is that you shouldn't have any references in your results section. Nothing about your results section should have come from other people's work, unless of course you are retesting that. So if you are taking analyses from someone else and you're plotting them again, then you can reference that. But essentially everything about your results should be your own work. So your own maps, your own measurements, your graphs that you've produced from those measurements, and any other field observations that you've obtained. So if you create a geological map, you would put it in here. If you did rock testing, you would put the results in here. And you don't need to give us every single little results. You can give us a summary of the results, especially for rock testing. There's often a lot of different criteria that go into these tests. So you don't have to give every single little one. Those can go into an appendix. But make sure that you only put in your results. So you're describing your results, and you typically do this in a logical order. So for an ore deposits type project, you would look first at field observations. So what are the rock types and what are the relationships with the rock types? And was there any deformation and or metamorphism associated with the area? Remember, this is what you have discovered, what you have observed. And then after that, you would put analytical observations. So geochemical analyses or rock testing, anything like that. So all of your studies should have observations about what you actually saw in the field and then what you tested. So if you were doing soil sampling, you would describe how the soils looked in the field, and then you would describe their analytical properties from what you tested of them. So remember, the crucial word here is describe. You are just describing. You are not discussing. What did you see? That is like saying you saw a tree with green leaves and brown bark. Okay, anything beyond that is an interpretation. As a scientist, the discussion is the most important part of any part of academic writing. So this is where you are going to discuss your results and what they mean. So you've already described your results in your results section. Okay, so remember the word described. Now you are going to discuss your results and how these results link to your aims and or your research question. So this is really important. Without a discussion, you just have a series of analyses or results. In your discussion, you will use information gathered from other sources beyond your own results. So this would normally be in the form of journal articles or books or technical reports or any other paper that is citable. And you will compare your results with other sources to draw broader conclusions about what your work means. So without this, we wouldn't have a discussion. And like I said, then all you would have are your results. But your results would only take the form of a technical report because the results on their own don't have any significant meaning. We need to go beyond that to produce science, to then say, what is the purpose of doing this? What are we actually trying to test here? What is our research question? And that is where we're going to tackle that in the discussion. And so that is why we call this the why section again. So we're going to incorporate the why that we laid out in the introduction so that we can cover the aims and objectives of our study. So here you're going to outline how what you collected as your results has allowed you to tick off those objective steps and therefore come to a conclusion which either supports or refutes your hypothesis or matches with your aim. If you have a variety of situations that this could match, so this is starting to get a little bit non-specific. So if I talk again about that project idea of looking at the structural geology along the coastline of KZN, let's say, for example, you get some results back and one person did a study 10 years ago to show that this is how Gondwana broke up, and then someone else did a study 20 years ago to show that's how their study showed that Gondwana broke up. Now you've got your results. Now what you're going to do is you can compare what you found to what person A found and what person B found. And either it supports one of their models or you have to make up your own model. And that is where you start to produce pure science. So you're starting to actually create content. And that content is created in discussion. Now remember that you aren't having to create content that is new. You can simply be supporting other people's hypotheses, and that's absolutely fine because you're not at a PhD level yet, which is where that has to be done. And also remember that in most cases, the simple answer is the best answer. You don't need to go to this convoluted process and all of these crazy arguments to draw simple conclusions. And just because a simple conclusion doesn't mean it's not valuable. Okay, so you don't need to make this complex. You just need to make sure that in your discussion, you tick off how you discussed all your objectives and what the aims came out as. So did you actually manage to constrain the structural geology history of the KZN coastline and how it links to the steps of Gondwana breakup? Well, yes, you did. And you did that by either saying that it matched someone else's model or creating your own model of how those processes occurred. So it doesn't have to be really complicated. Okay, so just make sure that your hypothesis has been tested, whether by the hypothesis you proposed or an alternate hypothesis, and then make sure that you conclude, which is the next section, the most plausible outcomes for your study. So that first line there is really important when we're talking about conclusions, that a discussion is not the same as a conclusion. A conclusion is a section where we summarize the main points that have been derived from both your results and your discussion. So we shouldn't be talking about new information in your discussion. There shouldn't be any new points made. So we shouldn't be drawing comparisons and we shouldn't be comparing stuff with other processes. This is where you essentially summarize what your results were and what they meant. So we don't want to make new points. Everything that is in the conclusion section should have been discussed in the discussion. So it's the one time, really, when you're writing in prose that you are able to use bullet points. So you can use bullet points, but that doesn't mean you must use really short sentences. Please continue to write in prose. Don't write in, lists, but you can have bullet points in your conclusions if you choose. Typically in a paper, you would have a section for acknowledgements after your conclusion, but often I think with honors dissertation, students put their acknowledgements in the beginning. That's up to you where you choose to put them. If you're going to write an acknowledgement section, that is where you will acknowledge people that have contributed to your research. So for example, your supervisor, obviously they have contributed to your research. If you had assistants with field work, then you will put those people in there. So if you needed someone to help you carry samples, then you will acknowledge their assistance. And then obviously if you did laboratory analyses, then whoever helps you with the laboratory work needs to be acknowledged there. So it's not a section where you thank your every granny and auntie and uncle. If you want to do that, you can, it's your choice, but also make sure that you thank the people and acknowledge the people that actually contributed to your work. When you're trying to construct your thesis and you're starting to feel like you're getting lost, what is a discussion, what is a conclusion, please refer back to this little diagram. So this shows you the difference between a discussion and a conclusion. So everything in the top part of the diagram up here is what should be in a discussion, and everything down here is what should be in a conclusion. So a discussion is where you interpret your results. You actually say, what do they mean? So for example, if you're doing a paleomagnetic study, what do those paleomagnetic directions mean? And then you can compare your results to those from previous studies. You can also discuss the limitations of your results. So do you actually have enough data to make a distinct conclusion? Are there gaps in your research? Is there something that should have been added to that? And then also you can highlight any unexpected results. So if you have really strange outliers in your data, you can talk about those as well. And then also mention how your results add value to previous studies. So if you know that you're contributing something new to the science, then obviously you need to include how that will change people's perception of that part of science. In your conclusion, you obviously need to restate your hypothesis, and don't copy and paste it. You can rewrite it, but you need to make sure that when the reader is reading your conclusions, they remember what the purpose of the research is. Okay, so instead of having that word hypothesis, just think about it as the purpose of your research. Then you can restate your most important findings. So that is essentially a summary of the most important results. You can again highlight the limitations of your study and what is the significance of your study. So that's looking back at the discussion again, and any future direction that needs to be taken. So this isn't typically critical, but if you're doing a rock engineering project and you're looking at building a road somewhere, obviously you would need to have some sort of recommendation. So that can be included in your conclusion as well. One of the most important assets really in a thesis or a dissertation is your references, or are your references, I should say. And this is separated into first content and secondly format. So what are you actually referencing and how are you referencing it? So no scientific document can be complete without references. And this includes in-text references and references that you find in a list at the end of the document. Because references acknowledge the work that has been done on that topic already. And there is nothing that you will ever produce which does not reference anything else. One of the things that I find that, especially in honors students, dissertations, that happens quite a lot, is they tend to reference textbooks. And I'm talking specifically about the Geology of South Africa textbook that students often reference. And this is not always adequate, because a textbook is essentially a summary of work that's been done on that topic to date. And different textbooks are directed at different levels of study. So if you're learning about something, so say for example, you're learning about the stratigraphy of South Africa, then a textbook, that textbook in particular, is a fantastic place to start, because it's got all of the information that you would need to be able to learn about certain nomenclature and stratigraphic sequences. However, if we're talking about research based on particular stratigraphic units, then often it's a bit lacking in information. So what you need to make sure that you do is to include multiple sources of information, and you must include that material within your own writing. So you need to look at textbooks, and if the textbook is the first place that you start, that's fine, but then make sure you have an updated textbook and that you look at the references within that textbook and let those guide you to other sources of information. You need to look at journal articles. You need to look at articles that have fundamental science, so science that was sort of created a sub-discipline. So if you're talking about paleomagnetism, you have to look at where those studies were first conducted and where theories were first proposed. Then you need to look at more updated versions of those examples. So you need to make sure that you're up to date with current literature on the topic that you're doing. So it's not okay to ignore papers that are old because you say that they're out of date. Some of those papers are still correct today. And it's not okay to ignore recent studies because that just shows that you haven't done enough work. So for example, the Geology of South Africa was written in 2006, which means anything that has been published since then is not included in that textbook. So there won't be any current references that you will find in there. You must make sure you read the source material of what is important. So don't just read summaries of stuff and don't just read papers that you think are relevant. Find the papers that actually are relevant to your study, your techniques, and your study area. Now, what you need to do is when you find papers, and this happens to all academics, we download hundreds of papers all the time, a lot of those aren't applicable to your study. So what you need to do is you need to read a paper and you need to digest that information. Is this relevant to what I need? And if it is, then you need to make your own writing based on those ideas or facts. So you need to formulate your own sentences or paragraph on that work. Never, ever copy and paste anything from any source. If you copy and paste even a sentence from another person's work, that means that you have to then change that sentence significantly to make sure that you are not plagiarizing. And I've seen it all too often that when students change that sentence, they don't actually change the sentence adequately. They might change a few words, and sometimes those words change the meaning of the sentence. What you need to do, and this is a skill that you have to develop to be able to become a scientist, is you need to read something, understand what that something is trying to say. So if you're reading a journal article, what is that article trying to say? Is it relevant to what I need to say? And then incorporate the idea or the fact into your own writing. That is the only way you will make sure that you don't create any plagiarized reports. And then when you do this, when you incorporate an idea or a fact into your own work, you must reference it adequately. So you need to reference any and every sentence where the idea or data has come from an external source. Now, what often happens is students get tired of referencing the same thing because they've only read one paper and one paragraph has one reference in it and every sentence has the same reference. Then you need to expand your sources, because what that shows as a reader or an examiner is that you haven't read enough varied data to be able to show that those ideas have come from more than one place. Only when one study has been done on this particular thing or in one particular area would you obviously only have one source of information and therefore one available reference. So read a lot. You will read so many papers that are not relevant to your study, and that is part of being in academia. So you have to read stuff, and only when you've read 20 papers will you maybe find 6 or 7 that you actually can use. So don't be lazy. Once you've read the paper and in that paper somewhere you found that this piece of information is important and you want to include it in your study, make sure that you correctly reference the right source. And if you don't, this is called misreferencing. So don't just blindly reference the paper that you're reading if you don't know if that content has come originally from that paper. And this often happens when we're talking about fundamental principles or concepts, which have been referenced a lot by subsequent readers. So the easiest way for me to describe this to you is to give you an example. So you want to make sure you're always referencing the original author who stated or discussed an idea, especially when we're talking about fundamental facts. So for example, an author has discussed a particular process in a paper and related that process to their current findings. Now you've only read the more recent paper. They did not write the original argument, and therefore citing the latest paper is actually incorrect if you are wanting to talk about the process or the facts that initial paper brought forward. So you must reference the fundamental work. So that's what that first bullet point there says. Reference that fundamental work. So for example, Urban in 1977 showed that you can create monocrystalline chromite in the Bushveld complex when you introduce new primitive magma and mix that with an evolved magma in the magma chamber. So now that is a fundamental point or a fundamental discussion that was had in this paper. Now anyone that uses that model to then confirm what they see in their results doesn't change the fact of who actually created that model. So for example, if hypothetically I came along and wrote a paper about the processes and related it to another intrusion, and you only read my paper, you must actually reference and read the fundamental paper of Urban 1977. Because if that's what you're interested in, that is the paper you should be referencing, and not necessarily the paper written about a different intrusion. So be careful with your referencing. If you don't know what to reference, then ask your supervisor. They will be able to help you. They are not there to give you literature or tell you which papers that you should be reading. That's actually up to you as part of your scientific method. You need to go and investigate what makes sense and what is applicable. But be aware of what you're referencing, and don't just reference it because they mention that word and you have that same word in your thesis. We'll know which references are not appropriate. So once you've got the correct content and you're starting to actually incorporate references into your dissertation, you must reference them correctly. So your formatting style is really important. And you can choose a number of different styles, but please keep it logical, keep it consistent, and make sure that you always have the references in the correct format. So you have a reference style here. I don't know what any of the names are. This is the reference style I use. This is from a recent paper of mine. And you can see that if you have two authors, I use the word and. You can use an ampersand, but I prefer not to use the symbol. You have a comma after the names, and then you have the year. Multiple references in one section in parenthesis at the end of the sentence is delineated by a semicolon. And then if you have a single author, it's just their surname and the year. Again, semicolon for the next one. And if you have more than two authors, then we denote it saying the author et al. Now, et al means and others. So we're saying that there's a lot of authors in that paper. If you have two references that are from the same year, then you need to denote which one you are referring to. Now, this is going to sound confusing, but for example, there's a paper here, McGee et al., 2016, A. That means that there is more than one paper referenced in this document from McGee and others, 2016. So if you have the same authors and the same year, then you need to denote it using numbers at the end of the sentence. So you can see A, and then further on in the text, there will be a B as well. So make sure that you don't confuse which one is which. That's the hardest part. And the first one referred to will be the one that gets an A. The second one will be B. When you are writing references in your text, the references should appear at the end of the sentence. It is very disruptive to the reader if you put references in the middle of a sentence. So you can see here in this first section, you can see in the introductory paragraph, there's a sentence and then there's references at the end of the sentence about that information that is there. If you need to put a reference mid-sentence, then you can do that. And you'll see that I've put a description here. Typically, you will only do that when the in-sentence reference differs from the one at the end. So for example, if you look at this sentence here, you'll see it starts here, the KIP magmatic event occurred at that date, and that date has been referenced, with the sills in the main Karoo Basin intruding between a different date, and that has a different reference. So can you see how that reference pertains to that date, whereas this reference pertains to that date. So you can't have them all in one bracket because then we don't know where that information has come from. Another time when we need to use in-sentence references is when we are creating lists. So you can see here, we can see that these structures have previously been used to identify magma flow regimes in both dikes, and then we give examples. Okay, so that's just some of the literature that can be seen, and then sills and inclined sheets, and again, more examples. Now the references at the bottom are not the same as the references at the top, so therefore we can include them in separate brackets. So typically, most of your references will be at the end of the style and end of the sentence, unless you're following those two last examples. And this just makes it easier for the reader. You don't want to make it so that the reader is constantly looking at different brackets in the sentence. If there's one point that you're making in the sentence, then you need to put a reference. If there's variable points or lots of points that you need to make in that one sentence, then consider breaking that sentence up into multiple sentences and having a reference which pertains to that information at the end of each sentence. I know this sounds complicated and I'm going on about this, but it's actually really simple, and if you remember to do it from the beginning, then it'll be a lot easier than having to edit this sort of stuff towards the end of your thesis, or dissertation, I should say. So everything we've spoken about up until now has been in-text referencing, which means the text that you have throughout your dissertation, that is in-text referencing. At the end of your thesis or your dissertation or your essay, you will have a reference list. And what this list entails is every single citation from your text must be elaborated on in the list. So what the citation in the text says, so for example, McGee et al. 2016a, I can then go into my reference list and look for the name of that paper, where it is, how many pages it is, who the other authors are. So all of the details of that reference must be in your reference list. You can use software to import your references into a reference table at the end. One of them is EndNote. I don't know what any of the others are because I prefer not to use software. I prefer to do mine manually. That's my preference. It's really irritating to have to edit someone's thesis when they've used EndNote or one of those softwares, because you will have a certain style and it'll be all higgledy-piggledy, and then I have to come in and try and edit it, and it doesn't like you to do that. So that's why I prefer not to use software. If you copy and paste references from different sources, so say for example you've referenced 5 papers and you've copied and pasted that reference from a different paper, then all of the formats will be different in your reference list, which is unacceptable. You must make sure that you manually correct the differences between each reference so that you maintain a common structure throughout. So if you have your volume number emboldened in one section, it must be emboldened in all of them. And please make sure that you use one style and keep it the same throughout your reference list. A sloppy reference list has been the reason why a student didn't get a first-class pass, and this has happened multiple times in the past, and it's an issue that is easily remedied, but it takes a lot of time. So don't leave your reference list collation to the last minute. Make sure that you do it well ahead of time, because it may take you a day or more to make sure that your reference list is correct. The easiest way I find to do that is to print a version of your reference list and then go through the text. You can do this on your computer, you can search for them and actually cross the ones off that come up, and then highlight on your computer which ones are in the reference list. And you might find that you either have some in your list that aren't in the text, or you might have some that are in the text that aren't in the list. Okay, so make sure that you're really, really careful with making sure that everything is correct. The next topic we need to talk about are figures. Now, figures are extremely important in a geological dissertation because they really assist the reader in understanding the content, whether that be a geological field map or a methodology of complicated machinery or some sort of model that's being created. It's really helpful to visualize things in a figure. And that's often why figures can be so difficult to construct, because it takes a lot of thought process and ingenuity to be able to create content like that from scratch. When you create a figure, or when you use a figure from another text, your figure numbers should be continuous, and they should start from 1 upwards and go up from 1. If you don't have a lot of figures, so for example, if you're writing an essay and you've got 3 or 4 figures, it's perfectly fine to have figure 1, figure 2, figure 3, and figure 4. As you start to have more figures in text, and this often happens when you're writing a thesis or a dissertation and you've got a lot of figures in one section or in each section, then you can label them according to the chapter. So for example, in your introduction, which would be chapter 1, you would have your first figure be figure 1.1. And then from there you would go figure 1.2, figure 1.3, figure 1.4. In your next section, should you have a figure, say the next section is your geological setting, and you've got a map in there, that first figure would be figure 2.1, and 2.2, 2.3 onwards. The next section, methodology, your figure would be 3.1. I hope you're following me there. What I want you to not do, or what I don't want you to do, is use the numbering system according to the subsection where that figure is occurring in the text. So say, for example, in your methodology section, you've got some really complicated stuff and you're explaining aeromagnetics and all of the history behind it, and the section that you're talking about is figure 3.1.4.2. Don't call it that. Don't call your figure the name of the section or the number of the section. If it's in your methodology, it will be figure 3.1 or 3.2 or 3.3 or 3.4, depending on where it occurs in the succession of that chapter. So don't just use the figures numbers in the section that you're working with. Use it in the chapter. Okay, so we don't want to make it too complicated. So it's fine to have one division, so 3.1 instead of having, figure 17. It's easier to break that down as chapters. Okay. Every figure that you include in your essay or your thesis or your dissertation must be referred to in the text. So just like your reference list, you have to obviously have all of your references in the text and in the reference list. So if you have a figure in your text, figure 1.2, geological map of the field area, then you need to reference that in your text. If you have not referred to it in your text, then is it really necessary? So that's something that I always ask. You haven't referred to it in the text, which means you haven't spoken about it in the text. Figures should always be described in the text and not just referred to. So you must always make sure that you have a sentence there saying, what it is you're looking at or what the purpose of the figure is really. So don't just refer to it and then sort of ignore it for the rest of the time. Okay, make sure that there's a reason why that figure is in the text. When referring to figures in text, your format of referencing must be standard. So use the figure number in parenthesis after the appropriate statement. So say, for example, that sentence there, the synoptic chart for the 14th of August, figure 3.2. Don't write out a large description of what to see in the figure. So just write in brackets, figure and then the number, or fig dot and then the number. Don't refer too much as say, see figure 3.2 or please refer to figure 3.2 unless you've got something really specific that you want them to see in that figure. So for example, if you want them to see red arrows in figure 3.2, pointing out something very specific. But everything should be described in your caption, so you shouldn't need to have that much detail in your figure reference. When you're writing your figure reference in the text in full, so you've got it in running text, then you need to write the word figure out in full. So you can see here when you've got reference there in brackets, you just abbreviate the word figure. But when you're actually writing it out in text, you must write figure 3.2 in full. And when you're referring to in running text without a bracket and not at the start of the sentence, you use a lowercase f, so figure 3.2. Small conventions, really important, really consistent. And these things you will never forget. So you'll always remember these sorts of formatting processes. And if you start doing this from the beginning, it will save your supervisor so much hassle having to correct all of these things and trying to get you to remember to do it every time because you've already done it wrong up until then. One thing about figures that students often don't think about is that they don't necessarily explain those figures, whether that be in the text or in the caption. And I often find that a figure isn't even referred to in the text because no one's even described it. So you need to make sure that the figures are explained in the text and in the caption. You can have less detail in the caption, but someone should be able to look at your figure and read the caption and understand the content of that figure. So the more complicated the figure, the longer your caption is likely to be, because the caption explains all of the details of the figure, especially if there is not a comprehensive legend. So if you've got a lot of symbols, a lot of lines, a lot of different colors, and you don't have all of those in the legend, you will need to explain those additional settings or those additional functions in your caption. Figures often can have multiple panels. So this is when we have more than one figure within that figure. So you could have different photographs, or you can have a map and then a photograph and then a scale drawing. Those are what we refer to as panels within a figure. And when you are referring to a paneled figure in the text, first refer to the overall figure and then describe each of the panels. So this would be in your caption I'm talking about now, sorry. So you can see there an example of a caption, figure 1.3, photomicrographs of dolerite sills. So that is describing the whole figure in general. And then A shows those photographs taken under plane polarized light, and B shows photographs taken under cross polarizers. So that is an example of how to lay out your caption. When you are referring to a figure in the text and you only want to refer to one panel, you have to refer to figure panel A before you refer to panel B. And this goes for all figures. So if you have 4 figures in your introduction, they should appear in the text in the same area where the figure reference is occurring. So if you're referencing figure 1.2 before you reference figure 1.1, then you need to swap the names of those around. You need to swap those figures around, because you need to refer to them in the correct order. So we have to have it going from 1.1 to 1.2 to 1.3 in the text. And the same thing goes for the panels. So you can refer to figure 1.3a and then 1.3b, but not the other way around. If you are referring it to the other way around, then you need to switch the panels in your figure. Hope that makes sense. When you are including a figure that is not your own original work, then you have to reference it as such. If you are writing a paper to be published in a journal, you can't actually use someone else's figure, and that is because of copyright issues. So you shouldn't ever really be taking someone else's figure from a journal article or from a textbook and putting it into your content and your work as your own work. And if you do this, it has to be suitably referenced. Even if you change it and modify it, you still have to reference where you got some of that content from. And there are certain ways that we can reference a figure in the text of the caption. So these references will go into the caption of the figure. So if you don't change the image and you take someone's image or figure directly from their paper, then you will say from. If you change it slightly, and so you might have changed the colors or you might have added some stuff in there, then you can say either modified from or after that reference. If you changed it a lot and you only took the basic information out of that figure, then you can say after. Okay, so make sure that you use the right reference in the caption. Okay, so we're not talking about these in the text, this is in the caption because you're referring to where you sourced that figure from. And don't forget that when you are constructing a reference list, to include these references in the reference list. So sometimes the figure captions will reference a figure that doesn't reference anything else in the text. So just always make sure that you include the figure caption references in your reference list as well. Those are sometimes sneaky ones that can get left out. So I put an example in of a figure from a paper recently where you can see all of the things that I've just described in the previous slides. So here is a figure maximizing the amount of information that the reader is seeing. So you can see there's 4 different what we call panels, A, B, C, and D. And in there we've got different information about one particular theme. So make sure that you make your figures thematic. So you don't want to have different themed things occurring in one figure. So you wouldn't put a different method with a different model for your discussion. That just doesn't make any sense. Group your panels appropriately. So if you're doing photographs, then put all the photographs in one figure. If you're doing photomicrographs, then you can choose to put all of those in one figure. So what I've done here is I've separated these into panels, and this is from a paper. So we use very simple numbering conventions. So this is just figure 2. And you can see that first sentence there describes the figure overall. So the formation processes of magma flow indicators. And then for each panel, there's a description there for that particular example. Now what you'll also notice is that at the end of each sentence for each panel, I've got the appropriate reference for where that information has come from. It's been changed quite a lot, so it says after Liss et al. 2002. And you'll see that for each panel, I have sourced the original data from some source. So each of these has a paper or more than one paper where I've taken the original diagrams from. What you'll also notice is that I have annotated these figures, which maximizes the amount of information that can be portrayed by a figure. So you can see that there's words, there's arrows, there's a whole bunch of different information that you can see from this figure. And why that's really important is because people often will flick through things and just look at the figures and read the caption and try and glean as much information from that study using the figures. So you can look at this and you can easily see that what the study is going to be about. It's going to be about magma flow indicators, and we're looking at how we can predict magma flow using different structures that we see preserved in dolerite intrusions. So try and maximize the information in your figure using text. Obviously, we don't want to put too much text. You want to make it simple, punchy, sharp, and then have the description of each one of those panels in your figure caption. We're nearly done. I know it's been a long lecture, but you've gotten a lot of information out of this, and hopefully you will actually be able to take this information and go forward and produce a really nice dissertation. So we've covered what a dissertation is, how to write an introduction, what is your methodology, geological setting, results, discussion, conclusion, how to put your references, how to construct figures and reference all of those as well. What I want to go through quickly are some of the issues that we find as supervisors or editors or anything like that come up very often. And we just try and reduce the amount of edits that we need to make as supervisors. So follow these points and try and reduce the amount of times you do these things, because every student does all of these things at some point. So the first thing is keep waffling to a minimum. I should probably follow my own advice here with the lecture. Try and use simple language and keep the amount of floral language or waffling to a minimum. And don't abuse the thesaurus. Okay? Don't change so many words that the meaning of your sentence is not adequately portrayed. Okay? So do not change critical scientific terms for variety. So sometimes it can feel like you're saying the same word over and over again, like the dip and strike is this, the dip and strike is this, the dip and strike is this. Don't all of a sudden stop calling it the dip and strike because you feel like you're repeating yourself so many times. Okay, think about how you can change it up. So you might say that the dip and strike of the sandstone was this, and then the siltstone was dipping at 20 degrees towards 010, or something like that. You can still say it in an interesting way without changing the terms. And the easiest way to understand how to do this is to read lots. So read lots of papers, read lots of work that's been written about the area of study that you're doing, and see how other people can incorporate variety without changing critical terms. The next one is to make sure that you portray logic without repetition. Okay, so if you don't understand the content of what you're doing, it will come across in your writing. And the most often the way that this is portrayed is by repeating yourself, because you're trying to, in a way, you're writing what you're thinking and you're thinking about it and you're trying to get that idea in your mind. So you keep repeating yourself to try and break that concept in your mind so that you can actually understand it. And what happens at the end is that you keep repeating yourself and it becomes very frustrating to read it. So if your text does not make sense, what you need to do is you need to take a step back, create a structure for your text, and then follow it. So if you know you want to talk about a rock type description, then make subheadings. Talk about the sandstone and then the siltstone and the dolerite, and then follow that structure that you've created. So break it down into smaller sections so that it isn't so overwhelming that you have too much content to talk about. When I write a paper, normally what I do is, start with the results and work through the results and have subheadings. And then I go on to the discussion. And in the discussion, I always write my subheadings before I write any content, because the subheadings will guide me from one section to the next, and it will make sure that I meet my aims and objectives. Okay, so know where your arguments are headed. Know what you're going to go to next, and make sure that your one section leads to the next section. Try and make it as logical as possible. Then if you break down your dissertation into sections, into subheadings, it will be so much less daunting, because you're not writing a discussion, you're writing one section on what something means. Okay, and look at other writing, look at other dissertations, other papers. How have they broken it down into different headings? So that's actually probably one of the most important ones, the most important advice that I can give you. Make sure that you read other papers and try and follow the structure that you see in those papers. Okay, you'll find it very repetitive. You'll see you're reading the same thing over and over and over again. But there's a reason for that, because it's comforting and we know it and we understand it, and it makes it easier to then understand the content. Okay. The next section is don't overuse commas. Don't have too many commas. Rather split a sentence into two different sentences. So if you find you've got 2 or 3 commas in one sentence, then potentially you need to make that 2 sentences. You obviously need to make sure you use commas in the grammatically correct sense. So if you're making lists, then you obviously need to list something using commas, or if you're using it after descriptive terms, then you need to have a comma. For example, if you start a sentence with however, it's however, comma, we can go to the beach, or therefore, comma, the sand is this, whatever. Okay, so make sure that you use them in the appropriate way. The next set of issues are a little bit more technical, so these are much easier to make sure you get them right. The first one is numerical values in text. Now this is fairly standard across all types of writing, that you can use text as either numbers or text depending on the volume or the size that you're talking about. So for example, this first sentence shows you what I'm talking about. There are 5 samples taken from each of the 15 sites. If a number is below 10, then you write it out in full. If a number is above 10, then you can write it as a number. So that's typically the convention that people use. Anything below 10 is written with text, anything above 10 is written numerically. When you are referring to a value that is in an equation or quantification, so if you're quantifying anything, then you must use it as a number. So for example, if you're talking about 5 millimeters, don't write that out. That must be a numerical constant or numerical value. If you begin a sentence, however, with a number, then you must write it out in full. So for example, 1,000 soldiers perished in the battle. Okay, that's acceptable to start a sentence with that sort of number. However, I would not start a sentence with 5 millimeters. Okay, so you would never write that at the beginning of a sentence. Try and construct your sentence so that the numbers are away from the start of the sentence. When using SI units, SI stands for Standard International Units, so these are percentage, centimeters, all the things that we use all the time. Then you must leave a space between the number and the unit. So for example, 60 centimeters actually has a space between the number and the unit. The exception here is percentage. and percentage is always written with no space. So there's no gap between the number and the unit. If you're talking about lengths, so you're listing a length or a dimension, then you must hyphenate the phrase. So if you're using 60 centimeters long, then it's hyphenated, okay, or it's 60 centimeters wide. That is always hyphenated. And all three of those words are joined together. When creating a degree symbol, please use the degree symbol that you find in the symbols section. Now this is, you can see there, the little tab that I've put on the right hand side. If you go into Microsoft Word, you will see in the Insert tab right at the right hand side, it says Symbol. And if you click on that, it'll have a drop down menu and you can select the degree symbol. You must not use a superscript 0 or O symbol. It will look different. Make sure you use the correct degree symbol. So you can see that one that I have there. That is the correct symbol to use for a degree. Another thing to use, which is often neglected in text, is to use an on dash, which looks like a long hyphen. And we use this when we're linking numbers or orientations. So for example, north, east, southwest, we link that with an on dash, which is not a hyphen, okay? It's a different thing. It's not two hyphens joined together either. And the easiest way to do this is in Microsoft Word is to press space, hyphen space, and then carry on typing and then delete the spaces between that. Because when you leave a space in between a hyphen, it will automatically convert that hyphen into an on dash, okay? So that's a really nifty trick to remember. So this is the last slide. This is probably the most important piece of advice that I can give you. But before we get to that, I just want to tell you how I construct a paper or how I would write a dissertation. When you're looking at what your study is, the first thing you should be doing is writing a literature review. This not only helps you understand the content, but it also helps you to figure out where you lie within that field of literature. So what sort of aspect are you going towards within that literary sense? And when you do that, it helps you conceptualize your study going forward. So writing literature review is really important because it just, you might actually end up rewriting the whole thing at the end of your thesis, but it's really important to make sure that you understand the content of what you're going to be dealing with. And particularly if you're going into the field, try and write your literature review before you go into the field, because it will just give you that extra leg up to make sure you understand what you're looking at when you're out there. Then I will go into the field. Normally, I like to do fieldwork projects. And then I come home and I write my results section. So actually the first portion of a paper that I will write, it will be the results. I'll draw my maps, I'll construct all of my figures, and I'll do all of those things first. And then I write my results about my figures. And I find this really helpful because I'm a visual person. I like to learn using figures and diagrams. So if I draw all my figures and then write about them, boom, there are your results, done. And I think this is something that a lot of people forget about. So, first thing, analyze the results, get some figures drafted, and then write about those figures. And then your results section's done. And it's not going to change because your results are observations. There's nothing subjective about them. It's all objective. Then I will write my discussion. And your discussion is definitely the most important part of your thesis, because that's where you start questioning what you've been doing. Why have I done this? What is the purpose of this? And that is where you outline the purpose. Once you've written your discussion, the meat is there. Now you've just got to pad it to make sure everything else is in place. So then I'll go and write my introduction, geological setting, methodology. And when I write my introduction, I'll make sure that everything in that introduction links with what I've talked about in the discussion. Because you shouldn't be talking about anything in the discussion that hasn't already been clarified or described in the introduction. So if you're talking about plate tectonic processes or paleomagnetism or rock mechanic breaking, testing, you have to describe those processes and those theories in your introductory sections. Then once you're done with that, you've written almost your whole thesis, then you go write your conclusions. Because your conclusion, remember, links your aim with your discussion. After you've written your conclusions, the last thing you have to do is write your abstract. And that should be easy at that point because you've done everything else. So write your abstract last. Make sure it covers everything. And bottom line, make sure that your aims and objectives are linked with what your discussion and conclusions say, so that you know that you've got parity between those two sections. Have a rough draft. I'm not saying that you mustn't write anything before then. You've got your literature review. Write your aims and objectives before you go into the field, but don't be scared to change them and make sure that they link up with what you do later on. Okay, it's really important. So just the last thing here is that just because you've written something down does not mean it's finished. This is so important. You cannot complete your dissertation by doing one draft. You will likely have 3, maybe even 4 drafts that are sent back to your supervisor before they can't deal with it anymore and they tell you it's fine. Don't be like that, please. Give us a draft which is readable, which is legible, and which makes sense. Use these tools and these hacks that I've given you to make sure that you get a well-constructed thesis which makes sense, okay? And you cannot produce a well-constructed, well-thought-out thesis without reading it. You cannot submit it without reading it. You cannot prove to me that you know what you're doing if you have not read and edited your own work. So you need to read it, edit it, and manipulate it to make sure that you've kinked out all of these things that I've already spoken about, so that I can then go later on and check all of the major things, which is more important. One thing that a few students have done in previous years, and something that I'll actually get you to do in one of your modules this year, is to peer review your peers' work. So, don't just submit a draft or an assignment without making sure that it makes sense. So get someone to read it. So even if it's an essay assignment, try and get someone who's relatively knowledgeable about the field to read through it and kind of point out where you've missed stuff or where you might have been repetitive, so that they can give you some constructive criticism about the piece of work. Now, obviously, you don't want them to be horrible about it or rip it apart or whatever, so maybe swap with each other, and then you can be able to give each other feedback. So are there holes in your argument? Did your referencing style work throughout there? Is it consistent? Does your discussion cover your aims and objectives and all that sort of stuff? And they might pick up on small spelling mistakes that you didn't notice or anything like that. So use each other, help each other out. It'll take, if you're writing an essay and it'll take someone about an hour to do that, but it can drastically improve your work. Okay, so use each other, use this information, and just go for it. And don't be scared to write. Just write stuff down. And if it's too much, we can edit it down. But if it's too little, it means so much more work for you at the end of the day. And what I want you to do with this information is to be prepared and to be ahead of everyone else. So make sure that at the end of the year, you're not stressing out about not having written your thesis and you've got 100 words and you should have a 20-page thesis done. Okay, work at it constantly and work through those procedures and use this information. Keep coming back to this and just watch, even if you're just not sure about one thing, come in back and watch that slide. Okay, and just do your best to make the best dissertation you can, something you can be proud of, and go for it. I believe in you guys. You're going to be great.